This is Things That Haunt Our Hallways, written by Ghostwriter of the Machine, read by Star1412. Rating, teen and up. Yagi was barely holding it together when Aizawa arrived. "It was a kid," he gasped out. Yagi had his hand balled up into a fist, and the fist was pressed to his lips, as if reminding himself that he could not start screaming. "Or young person, maybe 20, homeless, I think. Activated their quirk on reflex, then ran. The kids," here he pressed his fist harder to his mouth, sucked in a wheezing breath, as if the air itself was pushing down something with physical weight. "The kids scattered immediately," Aizawa finished for him, and Yagi managed a nod. Yagi's eyes were so dilated that the blue was almost invisible. He shook violently. He looked like a scarecrow in a windstorm. Someone activated a Fear-Inducer Quirk so powerful that it reduced all might to this. Of course Aizawa's class had bolted. "I'm sorry," Yagi gasped out, and his apology did not twist Aizawa's heart. It didn't. I tried. "It's fine," Aizawa said shortly. "You got hit with it too. Not your fault." He turned to face the other direction, moved to walk away. "I'm going to get them." Yagi's hand shot out, wrapped itself around Aizawa's upper arm. Aizawa paused. "Midoriya," croaked Yagi. I need to get Midoriya." Aizawa exhaled. He carefully extracted himself from Yagi's grip, and he always forgot how giant Yagi's hands were. "Toshinori, I'm going to get them," he repeated, firmer this time. "I'll bring them back here. All of them." And then he walked toward the ghost quarters entrance, to do just that. Behind them, Yagi crumpled into a shaking, shivering pile on the ground. The several-mile stretch of cityscape was called the Ghost Quarter, because nobody lived there. It was a remnant from one of Japan's earliest big threat villains, named Seismic, whose ability to control earth and ground matter was still one of the strongest recorded elemental quirks to ever exist. The Ghost Quarter was the site of the final battle to take him down. It had been hard and gruesome, a shudderingly high casualty number. The damage to the city itself had been astronomical. And because of the strength and nature of Seismic's towers, the damage was also irreversible. The land was fractured down to the bedrock. Geologists called it a tectonic anomaly. The ground so unstable that any efforts to build anything on it would result in catastrophe. The abandoned cityscape was mostly repurposed for education reasons these days, hero training or support item testing. Though if Aizawa was remembering correctly, it was also used as a filming location for movies occasionally. And apparently it was considered something of a holy grail for the urban exploration crowd because it was fairly heavily guarded and difficult to get into. His class had gone there as part of a unit on minimalizing collateral damage. His class had been hit by a very powerful Fear-Inducer Quirk. Aizawa couldn't think of a worse group of students to be hit by something like that. His highly trained, deeply traumatized, shockingly codependent problem children. "We can't all go in at once," Midnight explained to him. "The terrain is too unstable for most of our quirks, or even more than one person, not to mention we don't want to spook the kids any more than they already are." They really, really didn't. And the least likely to spook the students was Eraserhead, who also just happened to have the ideal quirk for the job. So Aizawa was going in alone. The kids had trackers in their shoes during field trips, a precaution taken after the disaster at their training camp. Mike was on the monitor and the comms, a voice in Aizawa's ear to direct him to them one at a time. Go in, find the students, one at a time. Knock them out by breaking a capsule of Midnight's somnambulist, which could last about half an hour away from her body. Setting up a signal, and another teacher would carefully pick their way to the sleeping kid and bring them to the base outside the Ghost Quarter while Aizawa moved on to the next one. A simple plan. A good plan, even. It was just one part that made Aizawa's chest ache. One at a time. He stood at the entrance to the quarter, exhaled. "Can you hear me, Eraser?" Mike's voice in his ear, checking the comms, grounding in its own right. "You're coming in fine," he responded. He pulled his goggles down over his eyes, more out of habit than anything else. Then pulled a rebreather over his nose and mouth, so he wouldn't breathe in the somnambulist himself. "I got the kids on the monitor," said Mike. "Who are we going to first?" Aizawa ignored his knee-jerk responses, the part of him that was screaming, "All of them, all at once, all 19, right away." Breathe. Compartmentalize. Be rational. He knew these kids. That was the reason they were sending him, and not Midnight. "Who's on the move, Mike?" Aizawa asked. "Right now?" A pause as Mike looked over the monitors, the tiny blipping dots of his terrified, panicking students. "Currently moving are Ashido, Ida, and Bakugo." "Rational, Shota," he repeated to himself. "Head, not heart. Never heart in a situation like this. At least not yet. Think about each of the kids, the terrain, the threats. Who's in the most danger?" He listened to the world around him. He couldn't hear any explosions. "Ida first," said Aizawa, and then took off to where Mike's voice guided him. All Idas ran like joy. They ran like running was the only thing that freed them. They ran like it was a struggle every day to keep themselves moving at a walk. Like they consistently forced themselves to move at the speed of others until the moment they kicked off the ground. Tensai ran like laughter, back when they were all in school, like easy jokes and gentle teasing and sure-win low-stakes bets, usually poking unsuspecting underclassmen into a doomed foot race. Tenya, Aizawa had discovered over the course of teaching him, ran like an exhale. Like tension leaving the shoulders. Like the only time he wasn't thinking and worrying about 100 different things was in the second before the run started. That was not how Tenya was running now. This was a stuttering, desperate gait of someone who knew exactly what they had to lose, and was certain they were seconds away from losing it. It was twisted and painful, and not anything Aizawa ever wanted to see on his 15-year-old student. Aizawa managed to keep pace with him, but barely. He needed to do this fast. A lesson, well remembered from Tensai's laughing bets. Only fools thought they could beat an Ida in an endurance run, even a terrified teenage Ida. Or maybe especially a terrified teenage Ida. Tenya ran back from campus from USJ, after all. "Ida," he attempted. Yagi had been fairly coherent under his fear, after all. No response. Ida's eyes were unfocused and glazed, darting to things that didn't exist, that Aizawa couldn't see. "Ida Tenya," he tried again, hoping the more personal aspect of a first name would help. That maybe the shock of his teacher being so familiar would be enough to get that kid to look at him and see him. Ida skidded to a stop, then used his momentum and an impressive hip pivot to deliver what would have been a cheekbone-crushing punch to the face, had Aizawa been a little bit slower. Thankfully, Aizawa was not a little slower, and Ida was panicking enough that his aim was sloppy. Aizawa ducked under the arm and performed a well-practiced move. Capture weapon up and around the arm, roll to one side, pull the attacker off balance. Ida fell and sprawled, another indication that whatever he was seeing, it wasn't his teacher. Aizawa sent out the other end of his capture weapon to bind his feet and keep him still. He was not prepared for Ida to keen or start struggling with a kind of desperation which cracked bones. He kicked out with both his bound feet, and Aizawa threw himself backward to avoid the impact. "Release me," Ida snarled, his voice breaking. His eyes were wild and unfocused, seeing something, obviously, but not anything real. "Let go of me." He struggled like he was drowning. Like the only thing which would make him breathe again was getting up onto his feet and continuing to run. Where, Aizawa couldn't know. He couldn't even know if he was running away or running towards. "Ida, you're under the influence of a quirk," Aizawa tried once more, in a desperate hope that it would work the third time. Ida responded by yanking and twisting the arm caught in the scarf, straining it in a way that Aizawa knew would pull ligaments if he didn't put a stop to it. He shook one of the somnambulist capsules into his hand, flicked the rebreather around his neck up around his nose and mouth, and then lunged forward to immobilize his student before he hurt himself. Aizawa got one hand on Ida's shoulder, cracked the capsule, then held him as he struggled, and the gas disseminated through the air. And then Ida started crying. Deep, chest-rattling sobs bubbling out of him in time with his weakened thrashing against Aizawa's hand as the somnambulist took effect. "I need," Ida gulped out, tears on the edge of his voice. "I need to get there in time. I cannot fail him. I cannot fail him. I need to get there or everyone is going to." He was falling now, still struggling against his heavy eyelids. "You got there, Ida," Aizawa found himself murmuring to him. "You did it. Everyone's fine. Just go to sleep, and I'll take care of the rest." "I can't." "Sleep." With one last weak thrash against his teacher's hands, Ida's eyes fell shut, and his body went slack. Aizawa carefully slid Ida's glasses off his face and put him into the front pocket of his uniform. He tapped the comm link on. Ida's secured, he said. Send somebody to get him. Ectoplasm's already moving, Eraser, said Mike. Who are we going to next? Aizawa took a moment to center himself again. Rational, he reminded himself. Rational. Aizawa knew his kids. He'd gone to Ida first because he knew there was no way Ida would react to fear this intense in any way but running. He knew that, of all his students, Ida was one of the only ones who had a chance of slipping out of the ghost quarter or colliding directly with one of the electric fences on the perimeter. Aizawa listened. He still heard no explosions. He still knew his kids. Bring me to Tokoyami, he said. Aizawa saw Dark Shadow before he saw Tokoyami, rising over the crumbling wall of a ruined building, thrashing back and forth like a particularly well-coordinated swarm of bees. Larger than he usually was, but Aizawa expected that. Aizawa also knew what Dark Shadow did when his human panicked, and it was an overcast day, which didn't help. He only wondered why they were staying so stationary. He vaulted the wall, and the answer made his stomach drop. Tokoyami must have found some kind of electrical wire in the building's rubble. He had used it to lash his right hand, from wrist to elbow, to a piece of rebar, which wrapped its way around through the foundation. Whenever Dark Shadow reached the limit of his range, Tokoyami lurched forward, but did not move. The wire was biting into his skin. Right beneath the notch of his wrist, a cut was bleeding sluggishly. Aizawa took another hesitant step forward. At the sound of his footfall, Dark Shadow screeched and swooped in closer, and Tokoyami cringed away from him, curling closer to the crumbling wall. "Don't come any closer!" he cried out, his voice breaking like a dropped glass. "Stay away from me, I'm going to hurt you." Aizawa dropped into an easy crouch. The Dark Shadow passed above him with a pained roar. "Tokoyami." "Mr. Aizawa, please stay back." Aizawa froze momentarily, not expecting the kid to be able to recognize him. "I'm going to hurt you," Tokoyami said again, more to himself this time than to Aizawa. "I'm going to hurt you. I always end up hurting someone. I always make things worse." Tokoyami was one of Aizawa's more reserved students. His dramatics, while present, because Aizawa had yet to meet a 15-year-old without dramatics, were understated and turned inward. He was quiet about his emotions, feeling them deeply, but rarely expressing the need to share them with the entire world around him the way, say, Kirishima did. This level of panic and self-hatred was uncharted. Aizawa moved another step forward, slowly. Dark Shadow flew straight up, and Tokoyami arched as the end of their range was hit. He sucked in a long, pained breath. "I can't control him. I can't control him." Tokoyami's voice faded into muttering, over and over, a mantra to keep time with the way he rocked himself back and forth. He buried his beak in his knees. "I'm going to hurt you. I can't control him." Aizawa looked up at how high off the ground Dark Shadow was. He measured the distance between himself and Tokoyami. He thought back to the last time they tested Dark Shadow's reflex speed in hero training. Sometimes, even for underground heroes, the best course of action was the most direct one. Aizawa ducked low and darted forward, the capsule of Somnambulist already in between his fingers. Dark Shadow dove toward him, eyes feral, streamlined into a perfect dive bomb. Tokoyami curled himself closer to his bound arm, a no tearing himself out of his throat like it was something alive. Aizawa cracked the capsule, tossed it with the precision of all his years as a pro, then rolled to the side as Dark Shadow approached the ground. Tokoyami gasped in twice, on a sob. His beak was still buried in his knees, but each breath brought the somnambulist deeper into his lungs. Aizawa dodged another strike by Dark Shadow, but he was already slowing. Midnight's quirk worked fast. Tokoyami inhaled again, and then started to sway. "I'm sorry," he said. "I'm so sorry, Sensei." "It's okay, Tokoyami. It's okay." Aizawa watched Dark Shadow sink back into his person. "Nobody got hurt. You did well, kid." Tokoyami swayed against the binding on his arms, and Dark Shadow was nearly back to his usual size, butting up against Tokoyami's damp cheek like a strange little cat. "I'm sorry," the kid murmured out one more time, before going completely limp, breath evened out in sleep. Aizawa moved. The wire was now taking far too much of Tokoyami's body weight, forcing his arm into an awkward angle, cutting directly into his skin. He sliced through the wire with his knife in one smooth motion and then caught the kid as he slumped to the ground. Aizawa could have gone his entire life without knowing how tears made Tokoyami's feathers clump. He tapped his comm, but Mike was already speaking. Sending someone to his location now, Eraser. Do we have a medic at the gates? Yep, Mike said, and recovery girl on standby once we get all your chicks home. Okay, good. Aizawa carefully folded Tokoyami's injured arm to his chest. Tokoyami is going to need bandages, at the very least. You got it. After one last moment spent at Tokoyami's side, Aizawa got to his feet. Mike gave him a moment to think. Too safe now. Bakugo next. He knew he could trust Bakugo not to instantly start blasting. His student has his fair share of issues, God knew, but quirk control was not one of them. Aizawa had seen Bakugo shrug his way through situations which traditionally cause quirk control to slip in children his age. Being startled, an unexpected blow, stress, dealing with too much sensory information. From what Aizawa understood, Bakugo essentially spent his entire childhood focused on little else except quirk control and perception. He knew how to make his explosion dangerous, but that also meant he was well practiced at making his explosion safe. So Aizawa knew he'd have enough time to get Ida, his flight risk, and Tokoyami, whose quirk reacted so poorly to heightened negative emotions, before he moved to Bakugo. That being said, a quirk like that in a terrain this unstable was a recipe for disaster, and Aizawa needed to move quickly. In his ear, Mike said, "He's moving between the 3 buildings to the right of you, keeping to the ground floors mostly." Got it. Aizawa moved to the center of the street. He dropped his stealth training, made his footsteps heavy and consistent, kicked some pebbles and debris around as he went. He stopped, body loose, senses heightened, ready. "You can come out now," Aizawa called, voice echoing. "Come on, I know you're hiding." "Interesting strategy," muttered Mike, but Aizawa ignored him. "Come out, Katsuki," he said, adding just a touch of mocking to his voice this time. "You know what's going on here, on some level. You're smart enough for that. Come out." A long silence followed. And then an entire teenage boy rocketed out of the lower window of the building closest to him, shoulders turned to shield his neck, an arm outstretched, sparks jumping off his fingers, a scream on his lips. Aizawa pivoted towards him, erasure flaring to life and capture weapon flying outward. The sparks died on Bakugo's fingertips, but the movement did not stop. He ducked under the ribbony white material and continued his charge. "Fuck you!" Bakugo roared, around a crackling voice. He tried for a blow to the solar plexus, which Aizawa weaved away from. "Finally decided to fight me like a man, huh, instead of slinking around corners and whispering shitty threat like some B-movie villain? Get some new fucking material, I've heard it all before." Slinking around corners and whispering shitty threats? The buildings Bakugo had been running between loomed above them. Aizawa's heart clenched. What had the kid been running from in there? What poured out of his own head to chase him through the ruined hallways? Bakugo fell back to prepare for another attack, and Aizawa got his first good look at the kid. There was dirt and ash smeared on his face, and the collar of his gym uniform was ripped, but otherwise he seemed blissfully unharmed, at least physically. Bakugo's face was twisted into a wild snarl. His pupils were dangerously blown. He was looking in Aizawa's direction, but his gaze was not locked in his teacher's face. It was as if he thought he was facing off an opponent significantly taller than Aizawa. He probably did. Bakugo reached out his hands behind him to propel himself forward, but he was still caught in erasure. Aizawa watched his student's hands clench and tremble. "What did you do to my quirk, you sick bastard?" he ground out. "It's me, Bakugo," said Aizawa. "It's Eraserhead. You know what my quirk does." "Don't give me that crap," Bakugo snarled back. And Aizawa gave up on getting the kid to see him. "I don't care what you did to me, I can beat you anyway." And then he rushed in again. Sloppy, the kind of combat Aizawa would tear apart if they were in training. But they weren't. He wished they were. Aizawa got his capture weapon around one wrist, then spun the kid around into a restraining pin, his arm barred over at Bakugo's chest. Bakugo began to struggle like a wild thing trapped in a snare, snarling like one as well. Aizawa cracked the somnambulist capsule in his palm and cupped it over the kid's face, forcing him to breathe in. "Let go of me!" Bakugo gasped out, still yanking, even as he slowed. "Fucking let go of me! I'm not going to let you take me again! You're not going to take me again! No! Shit! No! Fuck, Deku, stay back!" Then Bakugo's legs gave out, and he relaxed in his teacher's arms, dead asleep. Aizawa, careful as a surgeon, laid him on the ground. He knew what was chasing Bakugo through those buildings now, at least. Mike's voice broke the moment, low and familiar in his ear. "That was rough, Sho." Codenames in the field, Aizawa said automatically. He had to be Eraserhead right now. If he took even a moment to be Hidashi's show, he'd never get through this. Understood, said Mike, because he did. Someone's en route to him now. Where to next, Eraserhead? He had to keep going. Thankfully, some of his students were simpler to subdue. Ojiro and Hagakure ended up teaming up, finding someplace stable with most of the walls intact, and setting up an impressive, if feverishly put together, defense. They seemed to think that they were back at the USJ. Each of them took turns pushing the other behind them, desperate movements of protection. The teacher part of Aizawa's brain, which never seemed to shut off these days, noted to pair the two up more during exercises, as distract opponent with head-on aggressive combat while the human embodiment of stealth brains them from behind was a decent utility strategy, even if it was less effective as the two of them became slower and groggier from the somnambulist. He didn't think about how their shared last moment before sleep took them was still spent raising their arms to defend each other. Aizawa also found Sato and Aoyama, of all people, together, both kneeling in a shadowed, filthy alleyway. They didn't even notice his approach. That was terrifying in his own right. Sato stared fixedly at the wall, on the other side of the alley, shaking like a child wind-up toy. As Aizawa got closer, he could see raised lines on both of Sato's bare arms, obviously marks of his own nails raking up and down his skin. He couldn't do that anymore, though, because Aoyama had tangled their fingers together and was squeezing them. Sato kept pulling, trying to get his nails back to his arms, but Aoyama squeezed tighter each time. Non, non, mon ami, he was saying over and over again, feverish and desperate. None of that. Stop. Look at me. We're going to be fine. It's all going to be fine. Aizawa felt nothing but relief when both of their eyes closed. His first surprise was this. Ashido came to him, like a bat out of hell, launching an attack that surpassed Bakugo's in viciousness. She was going to be a truly spectacular close combat fighter once she grew into herself. She already was now, not giving him an inch, using her size and flexibility to their full advantages. Aizawa nearly had to fold himself in half backwards to avoid an acid-coated hand to the face. He sent his scarf toward her, and she twirled away like it was choreographed. Ashido's eyes snapped to his face, as panicked and vacant as the rest of his kids. "Do not fucking touch me," she snarled, like a wild, feral thing. The sweet and sunny girl who bothered him about his coffee habits and taught her classmates how to dance was nowhere to be seen. "Leave me alone. If you put your fucking hands on me, I will rip off your fingers with my teeth." And then she charged him again, running directly into the somnambulist Aizawa had just cracked between them. He caught her with his capture weapon, not his hands. He laid her gently on the ground, and requested that specifically Midnight come to get her. He went to Yaoyorozu next, and cursed himself when he saw her, because this he should have known. This he should have predicted. He should have come to her sooner. She was nearly emaciated. Slumped in the center of the ruined rooms, and surrounded by first aid materials, emergency supplies, water bottles, radios. Anything and everything a rescue operation could need. She seemed smaller than she was. She had her hands tucked to her chest, as if searching for more. She was quietly weeping. Aizawa took several more steps into the room. Yaoyorozu did not look up. He dropped to a crouch, so they were eye level. He activated erasure before she could hurt herself any more. "Yaoyorozu," he said quietly. Yaoyorozu's head snapped up. She looked at him with utter devastation in her eyes. "Mr. Aizawa," she said, tears falling steadily down her cheeks. "I'm so sorry." "Kid, what are you—" "I don't think I'm going to have enough to give." She looked at the objects around her. Her tears splashed onto the floor. "I don't think it's enough, Sensei. I'm so sorry." Aizawa took a capsule out of his utility belt and rolled it into his palm. "Yaoyorozu, I promise you," he said. "It's more than enough." And he cracked the capsule. She was still crying when she slumped to the ground. Kaminari was an expressive kid. High energy, easy to read, usually smiling. His low moods were uniquely easy to deal with among his peers. A gruff assurance that Aizawa knew he was trying and valued that above anything else. A chance to try again, a compliment toward his perseverance and progress, and then pushed him towards his friends to be hugged and jumped on. Even then, it wasn't something Aizawa found himself having to do very often. Kaminari was also a pretty happy kid. Kaminari was currently crying so hard that he couldn't move. Pressed into a corner with his knees to his chest and his forehead to his knees. The kid was crying, chest shaking, silent tears. His sister nodded into his hair. He didn't make a sound. No whimpers, no keens, just desperate breaths and murder-round sobs. Little licks of yellow electricity jumped from his skin any time Aizawa got close. Aizawa didn't call out to him. That was more likely to startle him than anything else, and the last thing either of them needed was a full hit of Kaminari's electricity. He put the kid to sleep, and listened to himself soothe like a toddler, calming his own sobbing as he dozed off, as if he'd done it 1,000 times before. Aizawa pulled feathers from his hair, lips pulling up into a scowl as he did. Koda called out instinctively to wildlife when he was that frightened. They responded as if he was one of their young. Aizawa fucking hated pigeons. "Not a word, Mike," he growled over the comms, as he leaned over Koda to make sure he was unharmed. There was a small bump on his head, probably from falling during a desperate run, but he seemed fine otherwise, thankfully. "Wasn't going to say a thing," said Mike, like the fucking liar he was. "Right," Aizawa snorted, purposely cold. He checked his utility belt, and then hit the comms again. "I need to come back to the gate, have to get more somnambulists. I'm all out. Let Midnight know. See you in a few." "Eraserhead, wait," Mike cut in, voice so serious that Aizawa froze. "I'm about to give you a location. You're close. You need to go and get Midoriya." "I just told you," said Aizawa, "that I need to go back and get more—" "No, Eraserhead, you need to go and get Midoriya now." Aizawa's blood went cold. "Why?" "Because he's very high up." On the list of things Aizawa never wanted to see in his life, Midoriya Izuku dangling his legs off the side of a building's roof was in the top 10. Aizawa stepped carefully, so carefully, closer to his student's slumped back, his traitorous fucking heart in his throat. He noticed Midoriya's white-knuckled grip on the parapet wall he was perched on top of. He could not startle him. He had to do this exactly right. "Midoriya," he risked speaking. "Hey, problem child, could you come back from the edge for me?" Midoriya kicked his legs a few times, like a child dipping their legs off a dock. "Hi, Mr. Aizawa," he said, voice oddly flat. "What are you doing here?" Aizawa took another cautious step forward. "I'm here to get you, Midoriya. Come back now." Midoriya tilted his head, as if he was hearing something, but not Aizawa. His eyes were horrifyingly blank. "It was nice, for a while," he said, in that same blank, conversational tone, as if he wasn't on the edge of a fucking roof. "What was nice?" Aizawa asked, edging closer. Keep him talking, keep him talking. He needed to get closer. "Being worth something," said Midoriya, and Aizawa felt the crack fissure open, deep inside himself. "What?" The word slipped from his lips, almost without his consent. Midoriya shrugged. "It was nice being worth something." Aizawa moved with slow, surgical precision. "That's right, Midoriya. You're very important to a lot of people." A slow, smooth shake of the head. "I won't be anymore." "That's not true. God, why did the kid have to choose to come this high up?" "It is. It's okay, Mr. Aizawa." He turned his head to face his teacher, face still horribly blank. For the first time all day, Aizawa wished for a crying child. He knew what to do with a crying Midoriya. "You don't need to lie. I know I'm nothing. I know I don't matter. I never have. It was stupid to think it could change." The kid twitched then. Not, in retrospect, an actual sway forward, but enough of a reminder that one might be coming that Aizawa moved without thinking anymore. He used his scarf for an extra layer of safety and leaned forward, cinching his arms around Midoriya's waist and throwing the both of them backwards, away from the edge. Midoriya was limp in his arms, boneless, like a lack of hope. "I wish I wasn't nothing," said the kid, quiet, nearly under his breath. Not a plea, just a statement. "I wish I wasn't worthless." Midoriya was far too complacent as Aizawa arranged him in his arms and stood, carrying him like a much younger child. His eyes were still wide, blank, and staring. "Why can't I just be better?" asked Midoriya, as Aizawa started heading back to the gate as fast as he could. Just enough. Aizawa needed all of his kids to be safe. He needed to be rational. There would be time to process whatever this was later. Yagi looked even worse than he had when Aizawa left. He was curled on the steps of the bus, where the students who were already retrieved were sleeping, like a shaking, guarding gargoyle. His head snapped up when he heard Aizawa approach, and the sight of Midoriya in his arms might as well have been a bolt of lightning. He jerked forward, arms reaching out to the both of them, making a wounded sound. "Midoriya," he said, breathless. Is Midoriya?" "He's fine," Aizawa said shortly, because he doesn't have time right now to explain what just happened. To explain that their student is currently limp and staring, as if his soul had been plucked out of his chest. "Here," he said instead. "Take him." And he plopped Midoriya into Yagi's lap. Yagi's arms snaked around him immediately, the entirety of his attention shifting to the kid. He ran his hands through Midoriya's curls, and hugged him close, ducking his head as he did. Midoriya, for his part, seemed very willing to be cuddled like a comfort object. He turned his face to Yagi's chest, and closed his eyes. Young Midoriya, my boy, oh my boy, I was so worried about you," said Yagi, quiet litany fueled by the fear quirk. "I was so worried. I am so glad you're safe." He rocked the two of them back and forth, and then swapped over to English, letting loose a quiet stream of nonsense. "Little star, little prince, oh my boy, sweetheart, son, precious thing, I thought I lost you. Midoriya's hand fisted itself in Yagi's shirt, and his shoulders began to shake. Aizawa turned on his heel and headed over to Midnight. He needed more somnambulists. He needed to get back out there. Next, Mike directed him to Sero and Soji, who were standing back to back in an empty courtyard, fighting viciously against something he could not see. He heard Sero roar at their invisible assailants, that he knew what bastards like them did to kids with mutant quirks, and Aizawa wanted nothing more than to sit down and weep, because why had so many people been so cruel to these kids? Aizawa watched Sero and Shoji succumb to sleep faster than the rest of their classmates. They'd already exhausted themselves before they started to inhale the gas. He signaled their location to one of his peers. He sprinted on. Jiro stood with her back against a wall, a shaking finger pressed to her lips, the universal sign for "be quiet." "You need to be careful, Sensei," she breathed out as he approached her. "They're going to hear you." "Who's going to hear me, Jiro?" Aizawa asked, even as she frantically signaled for him to hush. "Them," she pointed, with a finger that wasn't against her lips, to an empty stop across the street from them. Aizawa said, "I see," even though he didn't. "Do you want me to make them go away, Jiro?" Slowly, shakily, Jiro nodded her head. Aizawa broke the capsule in his palm and cupped it under her nose. "Take a big breath in," he said, and she complied. Nothing like the snarky rebel, who usually at least questioned his commands. She went down easily, and Aizawa caught her. Jiro was one of his smallest students, and was possibly the slightest. She felt like nothing in his arms. "You sure they're in this building, Mike?" Aizawa asked, walking carefully through the abandoned apartment complex. "Yes, 2 of them, though they're not together. Different apartments, it looks like. I can get you to the correct apartment for each one, but you're on your own once you're inside. The trackers aren't that accurate. I can take it from here, then." "I know you can, Eraser. Turn here. First one is through the door on your right." Aizawa asked, "Which one?" "Uraraka." "Got it," said Aizawa, then opened the door and entered. He found Uraraka in the sagging kitchen. She paced back and forth, opening cabinets, gathering decades-old canned food, and placing it on the table. She seemed eerily calm, moving with military-level precision, collecting the food, running her hands across the back of each cabinet to make sure she didn't miss anything. She activated her quirk and floated a few inches off the ground to look and see for herself as well. Aizawa allowed the somnambulist to begin filling the room. Something in the way she was standing made him feel like it was a bad idea to approach her, and he knew better than to doubt those instincts. Uraraka stared at the pile of food on the dust-covered table. "There's not going to be enough," she said dully. She began to inhale the gas, and sat down in one of the chairs when her knees began to feel weak. "We're not going to have enough." She pulled back her fist and hit the table once, hard enough to make Aizawa jump. "There isn't going to be enough," she repeated, but angrier this time. Aizawa stayed in the doorway, heart beating unusually fast. This was such a quiet, adult fear. It looked wrong on Narutaka's narrow shoulders. She rested her head on her arms, fingers tangling through her hair. Stress, long-lived in, fear, but familiar. Aizawa carefully paced into the room and rested his hand on the back of her neck. She leaned up into it, as if she'd known he was there all along. "Go to sleep, kid," said Aizawa, "and let the adults worry about that." He said it like they lived in a world where that could be true. He said it, and maybe he was saying it to soothe himself, as much as he was soothing her. It was common knowledge within the facility of UA that Todoroki Choto was hiding something awful and painful and too delicate to talk about, which also meant that it was also too delicate for all of them to press on. They knew this because Todoroki told it to him, in his wide-eyed confusion when confronted by praise, in his strange flinching reactions to normal movements. The way he and Midoriya went from barely acquaintances to nearly inseparable within the course of a few weeks. Todoroki Shoto was quiet and polite, and kept his emotions perfectly schooled until they broke. He was a dedicated student, a good fighter. The staff even got to watch him begin to stumble into learning how to be a friend. But they all knew something was wrong. Now Aizawa stared at the door of a coat closet, at the end of a hallway in a broken, abandoned apartment, and he wished that he pushed harder for his answer, instead of letting trust bloom slowly on its own. He reached out, grasped the handle, pulled the door open. Todoroki had both hands cupped over his nose and mouth, to muffle any sound even his breathing could make. Above them, his eyes were open and wild and very, very young. He was pushed to the very back of the closet, tucked into himself to become the smallest target possible, as if he wanted to fold himself completely out of existence. He shook. When the light hit his face, he whimpered. "Shit," Aizawa swore, and then fell into a crouch, and made himself less of a tall, looming figure. He fumbled for one of the capsules in his belt. "Hey, Todoroki, let's get you out of here, okay?" Todoroki pushed himself further against the back wall. He moved his arms to cover his face, as if blocking a blow. "He's going to," he said, in a voice that was small and muffled, and nothing like the Todoroki Aizawa taught every day. "He's going to find me." "He won't," Aizawa swore, already writing out plans in his head to make that statement absolutely true. "He's not going to find you. Not ever again." He broke the somnambulist as he slowly coaxed Todoroki out of the well-learned hiding spot, carving another promise onto the inside of his ribs as he did. There was no doubt in Aizawa's mind that Kirishima saw dead bodies which weren't there right now. Kneeling in the center of the street, staring at an empty place in front of him, he was the picture of frozen devastation. Arm half reached out in front of him, a hesitant, fluttering bird, wanting to touch, but unwilling to deal with the implications of that touch. He was muttering under his breath. "Come on, Ijiro, you must still be able to save them. You can still save them. You know, chest compressions, first aid, just reach out and... God, stop being so useless! Stop being so weak! Just reach out and..." His hand floated another inch or so forward before he snatched it back as if it were burned, cradling it to his chest. "Move, Ojiro," he said, rocking himself back and forth. "Come on, you idiot! Move!" But he didn't. He choked on a sob. Hardening began to climb up his arms. "Stupid, stupid! Come on, guys, please say something! Shit, Kirishima crumbled. He pressed his forehead into the road. Aizawa had the sudden, horrifying mental image of him rearing his head back and slamming it into the concrete. He sent out his capture weapon and restrained the kid without another thought. Aizawa knew better than to try talking to Kirishima at this point. It seemed like none of the kids who were this deep in the illusion had the power to see through it on their own. He cracked the capsule and waited for sleep to take Kirishima away from whatever he was seeing. His last student was sitting, still and calm as a picture, on the front steps of what used to be a bank. Asui had her chin sitting on her knees and her pinky finger in her mouth. She seemed to be chewing on it thoughtfully, eyes fixed somewhere else on the street. Her breathing was natural. She wasn't shaking. Aizawa walked up to her, slow and steady. His class is rock. Steady and easygoing and kind. Dependable even in her fear. He sat down next to her. "Hello, Asui," he said, his voice low and calm and steady. Slowly he turned her head to face him. Asui blinked a few times, as if bringing his face into focus. She stared at Aizawa for a long second. Then her eyes began to well up with tears. "I knew you would find me," she said. She sounded so much smaller than she usually did. "I knew you would. That's what you're supposed to do when you're lost and scared, right? You stay right where you are until an adult you can trust comes and finds you." And this, somehow, was what made Aizawa's eyes begin to flood over. He'd met Asui's mother before. She was a short, round woman, who walked with a limp and kept her hair cut in a practical bob. She had every bit of her daughter's blunt kindness, and a sense of patience which could only come from raising 4 children. And she had taught her daughter that, if she were ever lost, to stay calm, and stay where she was, and wait until someone came to find her, because someone would always come to find her. And Asui learned that lesson so deep in her heart that even pure, unnatural fear could not make her forget it. "You found me, Sensei," said Asui, a bit wetly, around the finger she was still chewing. "Yes, Asui," Aizawa said, "I found you." And then he offered her his hand. "Would you like to come home now?" Asui nodded and placed the hand she wasn't chewing into his, a young, trusting gesture, despite the fact that their hands were nearly the same size. "Yes, please, Mr. Aizawa. Is everyone else okay?" Tears were still rolling serenely down her face. "Yes, they're all waiting for us." "Oh, that's good, Sensei. I'm really glad." "Yeah, I am too." Carefully the 2 of them stood up and began to walk toward the gate. This was Chapter 1 of Things That Haunt Our Hallways, written by Ghost Rider of the Machine, recorded by Star1412. If you like this, please let Ghost Rider of the Machine know on the original story, link in the description, and let me know in the comments. And also, if you have any other ideas for fics I could read, let me know and I'll see what I can do. Thanks for listening!